Welcome to part 2 of Bob Lazar's story on UFOs, UAPs, and aliens. If you haven't seen part 1, make sure you check that out. We will leave a card above right now. Once you're done with that, hop over to part 2 and join us here. As always, support the show by hitting that like and subscribe button. Without further ado, let's go ahead and continue.
I don't think anybody really knew anything. They could just watch what was going on and make note of it.
How long were you there?
I'd say about 6 months or so.
And what progress was made while you were there?
Well, we came up with a bunch of reasonably good ideas about how the reactor worked. And one of them was the square base of it was essentially like a cyclotron, which is a small particle accelerator, a circular one. Particle accelerators, linear particle accelerators are just a, long tube essentially, and they accelerate particles with high voltage and radio frequencies till they reach high speeds. But a cyclotron does that in a small circular area. And there's this very heavy element fuel, element 115, something that wasn't on our periodic charts at the time.
But it is now.
It is now, yeah.
When did it become on the periodic table now, the way the charts now?
I don't remember. Do you remember when they...
2004, Darmstadt, Germany, I think is where they first fabricated 4 atoms. They lasted 220 milliseconds with the atoms. It's nothing, right? And then it later was discovered a couple more times they could fabricate it. Then they gave it a place then on the periodic chart after that, called it Moscovium.
So they told you about this stuff in 1982?
Yeah, well,
no,
we
not
kind of...
1982.
What year was this?
It was 88 and 89 when I was there.
Oh, okay.
82 is when
82 was when you were
at
at Los Alamos. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So 88, 89, they told you about this stuff. So this was not like...
No, they didn't tell me about it. That's one of the things that this group came up with.
That is wild. That is wild. It kind of builds credibility of his story, of the fact that he came out in the 80s, I think, with this story, or at least the early 90s, talking about element 115, and I believe he even had some of the actual element 115 that he kept, and the FBI raided his house and his warehouse where he does other scientific research and stuff like that, looking for this element 115 that supposedly didn't exist at the time. So he's talking about this element 115, and it ain't even on our periodic table. It turns out, well, we created a synthetic version through a collider, and now it's part of one of the elements on our periodic table. That's crazy how that lines up. Like I said, it builds credibility.
God, I keep losing my train of thought with this thing.
So this one area, this element 115 was the fuel.
Yeah, it was the fuel.
The world will forgive you for having a migraine. Can I just
It's really hard to think through this. Just give me a minute.
We'll just give you more booze.
I just want to say one. Yeah, definitely. I just want to say one thing. Bob, for the last 30 years, people have just been on the attack on Bob. Getting to know him, the personal effects on his life. It's really hard to understand unless you meet his family and his wife. I mean, this is the last thing he wanted to fucking do, was have to talk.
Yeah, we should explain that, Jeremy. That you and I had this conversation. I watched your documentary. We had this conversation, and I said, I have to talk to him.
Yeah.
The document, there's been detractors. There's been a bunch of people that called bullshit on many of the things that you've said. But over time, many of the things that you talked about, even in the 80s, have proven to be true. Things that people said were not true were proven to be true. Element 115 was one of them. Right?
Right. Element 115, the fuel they had, was stable. In other words, it didn't decay. It wasn't emitting radioactivity. When they synthesized 2 or 3 atoms of the 115, it did decay, and it was not a stable element. So they're kind of 2 different things. But this is kind of typical. Elements always have, or pretty much always have, stable isotopes and unstable isotopes. Like I think cesium has like 30 unstable isotopes to it. So, hydrogen, for example, you're familiar with hydrogen gas. It's stable. It's not radioactive. But there's also 2 other types of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. And deuterium isn't radioactive. It's another stable isotope of hydrogen. But tritium is radioactive. Now, they're all hydrogen, but they just have different amounts of neutrons. So it's the same thing with other elements and element 115. Depending on the amount of neutrons it has, designates the isotope, but it's 115. They will continue to take or experiment and try and make 115 at different isotopes, and I'm sure eventually they'll come up with a stable version, but it's the stable version that has the properties that we're talking about.
So they somehow...
That's a pretty clear explanation of element 115 in terms of what we're able to create right now versus what he actually utilized on the craft as a fuel source. Hands down, man, for something that happened that long ago and you're only around for 6 months, you're able to describe it in such a way that's actually able to be conceptually understood by somebody like me that's not even in the sciences. I'm within the mathematics field. Well done. Well done.
Or another had acquired a stable version. Did they say that the stable version had come with this craft?
Yeah, it absolutely came with the craft, yeah.
So at the time, you having a firm knowledge of the periodic chart and knowing what was real and what wasn't real, what was your reaction to having this stable element 115 that wasn't even supposed to exist?
Well, everything was impossible.
Right.
I mean, down to the metal. I did get a chance to look inside the craft on only one occasion, and this was important because where the reactor sat might have been critical to how it operated, since everything operates without any interconnection, so the placement of components might be critical. So they allowed me to go inside and look at it. Again, I forgot where the hell I am.
So you're going into this craft, and what are you thinking when you're inside of it? Like, what are you seeing?
It's a very ominous feeling because first of all, everything is one color. It's like a dark pewter color, and there are no right angles anywhere. It's as if somebody took, I've said this before, somebody took a model and fashioned it out of wax and then heated it just for a short time so everything melted. Everything looks like it's fused together. Everything has a radius of curvature where two items meet. It's a really weird looking thing, but there was almost nothing other than a small foldable hatchway that looked recognizable. Everything was really unworldly, to pick a way to describe it.
So you get inside this thing, and it's designed for something that's much smaller than a human being.
Yeah, you can't really stand up till you get to the very center of it.
And how tall are you?
I'm 5'10".
And what do you think this was designed for?
I'd say something close to half my height.
Wow. So these little 3-foot tallish creatures.
Yeah, and the seats were small too. I mean, obviously it was made, for something small. But there is no, there's nothing else in there. There's just seats, the reactor, and some of the subcomponents. There's no control panels. There's no bathroom. There's no decorative components or artwork or anything that you would recognize or trim. I mean, it's just a very bare bones thing.
You're not seeing any screens?
Well, there are archways around it that are part of the superstructure, and that one of the archways can become transparent. When I was in there was another group working on one of the archways, and you could call that a screen, more or less.
So through that archway,
with no bathrooms, and he hasn't hinted at it as a food source for these, aliens, extraterrestrials, ET. It kind of builds on the idea of them being interstellar. And just as we get into our car to go from one place to another that's relatively short distance, you don't need a bathroom in a vehicle necessarily if it's a short distance. And if they're able to travel trillions of light years really quickly in a short distance, why would you need food or a bathroom? Because you're just going to be coming back and forth really quickly. You're not here to stay. You're just here maybe to observe or do some sort of experiments or abductions, whatever it may be, right? So it's interesting that he brings it up because, again, like I said, there's no bathrooms. You might have food in your car, but if it's a short trip, hey, there's no reason for it. Or the guys that were there before just took it out. Not the bathroom, but the food.
It would maintain the solidity, the solid, whatever metal it was.
Yeah.
But you could see through it?
Yeah, it just became transparent. Yeah. I saw that happen once or twice before I left.
Did you ask any questions about what the fuck that was?
There's no asking questions.
There's no asking questions.
No.
But when you watch something become transparent and you realize it's still there, but you could now see through it.
Yeah, I mean, now that's not that impressive. We do have some liquid crystal materials that are like that. You know, they have
I've seen that in
smart
bathrooms.
glass. Yeah, they call it smart glass. So this is just, and I don't know if the craft is made of, you know, an advanced metal or a ceramic. It was cold to the touch, so you know, I would lean
And
more
again,
towards a metal.
You're not allowed to ask questions.
No, they work on the buddy system, so I can only exchange ideas and talk to Barry. Now this really interferes with science because science is based on free discussion. And ideally, you get a bunch of guys together, exchange ideas, work on problems, and that's how things move forward. But they're so over the top concerned about security, they split everything off, and everybody becomes stagnant. It just destroys any of the progress you can make, or at least makes it go so slow. I think they wind up shooting themselves in the foot.
Which is probably why they arrived at this bottleneck that they needed to get this madman with a jet-powered Honda to come in and see what he could do.
I think that was an act of desperation. I think they wanted someone that thinks out of the box and let's just give this guy a try here because
Right.
they weren't, and they might have done this 4 more times since, you know, up to the point in time today, assuming they're still working on this thing.
And when
Or the fact that he's expendable, because in part 1, he talked about how the guy that he was replacing probably blew himself up trying to basically go inside this energy source, this reactor. So he has a lot of qualifications. He's able to do the job, but he's also expendable. The guy blows himself up. Hey, we'll just find somebody else to meet these qualifications too, because Barry seems like he's the one that's kind of running the show, and more or less, Bob Lazar here is kind of like the teacher's assistant, kind of the aide. And I'm not trying to belittle the guy. The guy's a genius, but you understand the analogy that I'm making.
and you see this craft and you're inside, was there any indication that there was an area that they would use to control it, to pilot it? Was there a pilot seat? Was there...
There were 3 seats. They sat around, the reactor was in the dead center of it, and then equidistant around there were 3 seats.
So
and that's all. There was a large, they're not consoles, they're large rectangular objects, also spaced, equidistant around the center. There's nothing on them. There's no buttons. There's no lights. There's
and
no
they
controls.
look the same color, the same
Everything
thing.
is the same
It's
color.
just a different shape.
Right. And directly underneath them, there's 3 levels in the craft. The main level is what we're talking about. Directly under that, those are the gravity amplifiers, the big rectangular objects. Underneath them are the gravity emitters that look like, for lack of a better word, a trash can hanging on a pipe. 3 of those. And then the top layer, this is just my personal belief, I think that has to do with a navigation or their version of a computer with some planar panels, sensor panels around the craft that we would call portholes, but they're not portholes. They're just black areas. And I think that just determines its, position in space. But I physically was in the center section, and I stuck my torso in the bottom section and hung upside down so I could see how the gravity amplifiers were positioned.
What is the roughly the size of this thing?
It's I don't remember from being there, but after all this stuff was over, I had John Andrews, a guy from the Testers Model Corporation, and we sat down and tried to figure out from what I saw and known sizes of things, and we came up with 52 feet in diameter. And
So
I
it's
think
that's fairly small.
Yeah, so I think that's a reasonable guess.
Now, you said there's 9 of them, and you got a brief glimpse at the other ones. How were they different?
Oh, they looked completely different. One looked like I called a Jell-O mold, and it looked like a classic Jell-O mold with the rippled sides to it. One was a very flat disc, like like a straw hat or something like that. That was sitting up on its edge, and the thin part of it it looked like a projectile had been fired through the edge of it. So I don't know if they were attempting to see if the metal could be penetrated, or if that's where the thing came from. Maybe it was shot down. But that was the only one where I saw there was, actual physical damage to it.
And that one was roughly the same size? They're all...
They were kind of too far away to tell.
And did
Like I said in part one, man, I really wish you would have said, hey, there was one that looked like cigar, Tic Tac shape. It was white. I mean, that would have really built a crazy credibility, not just for Bob Lazar, but also for what happened on the Nimitz with Commander Fravor, seeing the Tic Tac go from, 80,000 plus feet down to a foot above sea level, zigzagging left and right, kind of watching his movements. If you haven't seen that, maybe we'll cover that episode on a later date. But man, maybe he'll get into it. We'll see.
There was several teams that were working on the propulsion system, so there was different teams that were working on these different aircrafts.
I don't know. I could only assume.
Right. Now, when you're sitting in this thing and you're looking at this otherworldly craft, your goal is to try to figure out how this thing functions. Your goal is to try to figure out how this reactor. I mean, but you would imagine they would give you more time than just one day to check that out.
Oh, it wasn't one day.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Barry was there. I think Barry was sleeping there. I'm sure they had. Now, that isn't weird. I mean, up at the Tonopah test range where they work on stealth fighters, you go, I think, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and you stay up there too. So it's not weird to stay up at the test site.
Right.
So, yeah, I think he pretty much, and he acted like he's been up there for a long time.
Yeah.
But
maybe he's still there.
Yeah, who knows?
Do you have contact with this guy?
No. Oh, no. I wish I did. I kind of thought he was going to come out after I did.
Right.
And I think I took so much flack and it's so much shit for what went on. I think I wound up helping security there, and everybody became afraid of, doing or saying anything after that.
So what kind of reports did you have to give? So you're not making much progress, right? You're just trying to figure out what this thing is, and it seems impossible.
Well, we didn't personally make them. I mean, we were always – there was never a lot of information that we gained. The guy, you would call him our supervisor, his name was Dennis Mariani, and kind of a military-looking guy. And he would routinely pop in, during the day and, hey, what's going on, guys? And he would essentially relay any information, anything new we came up with. I mean, he was our go-between, where we presented him the information, then he took it to wherever they were, assembling all the data from everybody.
Now, I assume you're working normal days, like an 8-hour day?
No.
No?
No, it was really weird that I would be only called in on certain times and certain days. And they would be weird hours, too. Most of the time was later in the evening. I mean, I can get a call at 11 o'clock at night, and they'll say, it's now 11 o'clock. By 11:45, you need to be at the McCarran terminal, and, we'll let you know when we have more information.
But what did you do while you were there? If you're looking at this object, this reactor, and you can't figure out what it is or how it works, other than the fact that it works on this element that we don't even know about.
Sure. I mean, the thing was what you do with anything. If you're trying to analyze it, all you can do is perform tests. And all we did is try and come up with every kind of test we possibly could. I mean, we tested, it violated a lot of what we thought was impossible to violate. I mean, one of the first laws of thermodynamics, I mean, essentially any machine, any device that operates always makes extra heat. Nothing works at 100% efficient. Even the headphones you're wearing, anything that takes power, some of that power is going to be converted to heat, and it's just wasted. This didn't. I mean, we looked at, back then we had infrared cameras. They're different today, but back then you had to pour liquid nitrogen into the camera to cool the sensor down and get these infrared images you've seen. But it never got, no matter what the load was on the reactor, it never got above the ambient temperature, which is impossible. I mean, you're, pulling out huge amounts of power and nothing ever gets warm. We tried measuring magnetic fields and there was nothing there. So we started playing around with the emission from the emitters, the gravity wave itself, and saw what we could do with it and how it was focused. So we really spent all our time just trying to see what the stuff can do and what we can control.
What's cool about this is that if you're looking at the new UFO, UAP footage that's come out within probably the last 2 or 3 years, you can tell what's kind of been faked, but also what is just one of our aircraft because it's emitting some sort of heat source, whether that's the exhaust or the flame or the propulsion from the vehicle, like a F-15, F-22. Those will emit, obviously, heat, and we can catch that on camera, to whereas there's a lot of footage that we're getting from certain objects that is moving, and it's moving fast, and there is no propulsion in terms of letting out some sort of exhaust or some sort of heat or energy differential that we can catch on camera. So it builds into Bob Lazar's story here of what we've actually seen on camera, and supposedly the United States government and other governments have a lot of footage, HD footage, of the stuff they're not releasing. Hopefully one day we get our hands on it.
So you were seeing what it could do, but you couldn't ever figure out how it was doing it.
No, not really. I mean, we really could only use come up with a best guess. Now, I can't say we really that I could absolutely state for certainty how anything actually worked.
Now, how did you know at all how they were piloting it? Because they were doing some tests where they were having these things fly around in the sky, and this is what gets us deeper into your story.
Right. I was out there for one test. Right. In fact, I was with Barry in the lab, and Dennis came in and said, "We're about to run a test. Why don't you guys come out?" Or I think he said, "Barry, why don't you come out here and bring Bob with you?" We went out there, and the craft was already outside the hangar and was just preparing to lift off. Now, they were in communication with somebody in the craft.
So there was a person in the craft?
Yeah, there was certainly a person in there. Now, it's not a comfortable place to be in because it's small, so the guy has to be sitting on the floor in the middle, my best guess.
And this is the same specific craft that you worked on? Because that was the only craft that you were in.
The only one that I touched and worked on. And it quietly lifted off the ground, which was incredibly impressive to see.
Quietly or silently?
Well, quietly, because it
Did it make some sort of a noise?
It produced a little corona discharge from the bottom. A corona discharge is kind of a high voltage brush, little bluish glow discharge. As it was lifting off the ground, you can hear a slight hiss sound. Now, as soon as it cleared the ground by about 5 or 10 feet, maybe even less than that, the hissing stopped and the blue glow disappeared. So it lifted off quietly, and then it hovered silently, if you want to be specific.
Wow. So then what kind of maneuvers was it doing?
It took off, for that particular time, it took off, moved a little around to the left and right, and then sat back down. The craft itself, they communicated with it with because I saw the guy talking in a regular VHF radio to the person in the craft. And I even saw the frequency that was on the frequency counter of the communication, the transceiver there. But what's weird is he shouldn't be able to communicate with the craft with a radio. The radio wave should bend around the craft. I mean, it shouldn't be possible. Every single thing about the craft and the way they operated didn't make any sense to us. I mean, that's something we talked about for a while after.
Why should the frequency bend around the
I'm wondering if the frequency would bend around the craft because of the gravitational aspect of anti-gravity would affect the radio waves, since it has to bend time and space. And radio waves, we know, travels through time and space, so it would bend it. That's my guess. We'll see if I'm right or wrong right now.
craft?
Well, you really have to look at the way the gravity wave comes out of the craft. There's the reactor's in the center, and there's a waveguide that goes up to the top. There's actually a small appendage that sticks out of the top of the craft, and it produces a heart-shaped gravitational distortion around the craft. Now, if the craft is sitting in the air and you walk underneath it and look up, you actually cannot see the craft. The light bends around it. You're bending gravity, bends light.
There we go.
It bends radio waves. It's it shouldn't be possible to communicate with a craft that has an envelope around it that's distorting all forms of energy. But they were apparently in contact with it.
Somehow or another, so through some unexplained way that they didn't bother explaining to you. Mm-hmm. So this thing gets up, it just does some very simple maneuvers, left, right, goes down. And did they discuss this with you? I mean, they said they wanted you to see it.
No, they just wanted, they didn't discuss anything with me. It sat down, we looked around for a bit, and Barry said, let's go back. We went back in the lab. All we got to do was see it. Fast forward to some months later, I did have the test flight schedule of the craft. Now, they had times they had designated high-performance tests. This obviously wasn't one that was a high-performance test. The high-performance test goes above the mountain range, and they do much more radical moves with the thing. Look, this is a prized item, and they're not doing anything like taking it out of the atmosphere or flying around to other countries or anything like that. They just play with this thing right over the test site. But they were doing some radical moves with it. And since I had the test flight schedule, statistically, the amount of traffic in the surrounding areas on the highway was lowest on Wednesdays. And that's why Dennis told us that all the test flights occurred only on Wednesdays, because it'd be the least chance that anyone would see what's going on.
And this was before the government had expanded the forbidden territory around Area 51 and Papoose Lake and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that occurred after my story came out. Then people started going up on the mountaintops and trying to look down into there, and they kind of freaked out and then did the land grab and pushed everybody back. But yeah, I think all that occurred long after that I came out.
So you're working there, and while you're working there, you're under this crazy schedule. Forgive me for explaining your story, but you would get these phone calls. You would have to go to the airport at 11 p.m., and your wife started thinking that you were having an affair.
Yeah, apparently so. Now, I did give my permission to have, as part of the, security clearance process, I gave written permission to have the phones monitored and things of that sort. So they weren't doing any covert stuff. They, with any Q clearance, which is civilian top secret clearance or military top secret clearance, they go talk to friends and, places you've been, make sure you're not connected to foreign countries. But, monitoring your phone is nothing unusual. However, they insisted that, you don't even talk to your loved one, to your partner, to your wife, whatever, about what's going on. So she was essentially in the dark and didn't know the phone was being monitored. Well, part of the security clearance is that not only do you not have any connections to foreign countries and aren't a maniac, but you have to have a stable home life too. Well, she started having an affair with a flight instructor. Now, they were monitoring this on the phone, and they knew it, and I didn't. So they stopped me.
That is a terrible story. The guy is grinding, right? He's trying to pay the bills. He's working on some crazy stuff, which I'm sure has to do with a lot of stress because you're working on something that's you've never seen before. Nobody's ever seen before. Your wife's cheating on you. You know you're being listened to and watched, and all this stuff takes place, man. God, what a terrible thing to go through.
Coming in, and their attitude at the time was, we need to see how this is going to play out, and if Lazar is going to get a little weird or anything. So let's just, hold him off from coming in and, see what happens.
And they explained this to you, what was happening?
Well, after the fact, yeah, because time kind of went on, and there were guys that were following me around, and I started getting a little concerned, going, well, shit, are they booting me out of the project? And if so, they're not just going to let me hang out at home and go get a new job knowing what I know. So as time went on, I started getting a little concerned, and I took my closest friends and just kind of got together and I said, hey, remember that job I told you about? This is what's going on. And you don't need to take my word for it. Wednesday night, we need to all go out here. I want to show you what's going on. So I took everybody, and we went out to, remember, since I had the test flight schedule, and went outside the base, out into the desert, and so everybody could see, one of the high-performance tests.
Interesting. So I'm wondering if he was more or less pushed out, where he wasn't tired of doing the job. He wanted to probably continue doing it. But when you have the feds on your you-know-what night and day, they're tracking you, they're watching you, you think, hey, these guys are going to kill me. Seemed like that's kind of what he was leading towards. That you're like, I need to at least get this story out some way, shape, or form. I need to let my friends know what's going on. So if I get ousted, they're not like, oh, he committed suicide, like we see with the Clintons all the time, right? Somebody connected to the Clintons all of a sudden shoots themselves or drop off the building. It's like, oh, it was suicide, right? They just disappeared somehow. So rather than him just disappearing, he's like, I'm going to cover my you-know-what, get everybody out there to film this stuff. And if something does happen to me, at least they have some sort of tracking to a bunch of group of friends to tell a story. Makes sense.
And, it left quite an imprint on everybody, so they knew I wasn't.
And there's videos
crazy.
of these tests, right?
Yeah, but remember, this is it's in the dark in the 80s with a big monster-sized camcorder, and you got, a bright light jumping around. But, yeah, I mean, we did video of it, but there's no, by today's standards, it's.
But is your video specifically available, the video that you took?
Yeah, well, George Knapp has it.
Is it online?
Do you know? I have no idea.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I show clips of it in my film. It's online, and someone did a deep analysis of it. It was interesting to take a look at how.
Pull this microphone up to your face. Keep it about a fist from your face.
All right. To see how his video looks now, but as far as video evidence, I mean, we are talking 80s camcorders. The most important thing is the human story here. Everybody that he took up there on 3 separate occasions, they don't all like each other. They don't all talk. They all agree on one thing. They saw something that night at the exact point in time and space that Bob Lazar said. And remember, this is 17 miles south of Area 51. No one even knew really about Area 51. We're talking Papoose Lake, and they all agree. They saw something that night they had never seen before, and they've never seen since, right when he said it. So that's one of like the 6 things where I'm like, how did he know? You can dismiss him. I tried to dismiss it. But some things we can't get around, and there's about 5 or 6 of them. How did he know about those?
If Jamie wants to find that video right now, what would he look under?
Bob Lazar, UFO, S4, Area 51, just kind of like that. So it's like the S4 UFO video, Bob Lazar, and a guy does an analysis, but you're analyzing these 80s videos.
Right.
He from the very beginning, Bob never said,
I'm sure it's super pixelated, like 144p. What's interesting is just the light aspect on basically the movement of it. That would really be the telling sign of the story of things zigzagging everywhere. It's probably a good idea to look at that light and say, hey, it's either a UFO. We can't do anything like that. Could it be faked? Sure. But he makes a great point here. Jeremy makes a great point of, hey, you know what? How do you know the exact time, the exact location? If you never worked there, if you've never been there before, how does he know all this? And he gets his friends out there. Again, it's just building credibility.
I have proof of my story and I'm going to tell the world. He said at the very beginning, I cannot prove my story. That's not why I'm telling this. George Knapp convinced him to tell people, and he lived through it. And I didn't believe it either until I talked with George.
Okay, so you film this test flight, one test flight, and then you get caught.
Actually, it was, I think, the 3rd time, because we went out there the first time. Everybody saw it. Everybody was amazed because it did some radical maneuvers, and everybody had a lot to say about it.
Maneuvers that I've seen the video. It doesn't. I don't think there's something we have now that does that.
No,
in terms of like a human piloted craft. I mean, I don't know, obviously, with the government.
No, it's impossible. Nothing can move like that. And remember, we didn't start filming from the very beginning. We were waiting for something, to happen. The craft took off and then came flying at us, stopped, turned at a right angle, flew back. And then, after it did some, amazing stuff, we to get the camera. And then we started filming. So it doesn't have all of it on there. It just has some.
The way I describe it to my friends, and they said, what does this look like? I said, take a laser pointer and then have a wall and then move it around the wall. Like, how it moves around the wall? It doesn't seem like it has anything to do with inertia or physics, or it's not impeded in any way by the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That's what it looked like.
You're essentially separated from reality. As crazy as that sounds, with being in its own gravitational envelope, inertia is not going to affect it. And, this is...
Makes sense.
This is how some of those recent sightings of Commander David Fravor, I'm sure you've heard of the Tic Tac UFO. I mean, he describes exactly, the thing operates exactly the way I was describing. That's why he was interested to talk to me. But we saw this, and, on the way home, it's like, hey, we got away with it. We should try it again the next test flight date. So this became a thing to do. And I think it was on the third time that we got caught. I mean, we started becoming a little careless. I think we took a motorhome out there. And, it was like the stupidest thing you could possibly imagine.
Started tailgating.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And
again, you're in your 20s.
Yeah. And, what was funny was we went out there, and my friend Gene Huff and I were leaning on the front of a vehicle. And just for some reason, we just started talking shit. Like, well, I hope they realize that, I don't remember what we were saying, but, that it's something about attacking the base or something along those lines and stealing the craft or something like that.
So crazy.
And then about 20 feet in front of us, we see a little green light fall on the ground and roll to us. And unbeknownst to us, now it's pitch black, you can't see your hand in front of your face. There were a bunch of guards standing right out there, and they had a night vision scope where they were like from here to the wall looking at us, listening to us, and the guy dropped it, and the scope rolled over to us, and you could see the green screen. We turned the lights on, and all these guys are there. So it was...
Whoa.
Yeah. So we did incredibly stupid stuff and got caught, as we should have.
So when they catch you and they bring you in, then what happens?
Well, I went in for debriefing. The following day, I went to Indian Springs Air Force Base, which is kind of a defunct base that they used to use at the nuclear test site. And this is when they brought out the transcript of the phone call with my wife. And, they sat me down and we said, when we meant to keep the secret, we meant you can't tell your friends, right? And it just being sarcastic and trying to. Mm-hmm. And then they got real serious. But this is where they, took the transcript out and were reading me what my wife and, our friend were talking about. And I don't know, it was a hard time.
So what happens from there?
Well, folks, what happens from there? We got to wait for a part 3 here on Supernatural Saturdays. If you're curious what Supernatural Saturdays is, because again, we are a political show, the Bald Brad Show. It's an opportunity to take one day out of the week to step aside from the politics and just the craziness of the world and dive into something fun, the unexplained, the paranormal, and the supernatural. We will be back next Saturday here for a part 3 and maybe even a part 4 here if you guys want to continue this of Bob Lazar's story. As always, hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you here tomorrow on The Bald Brad Show.